Hello, friends. I'm Jonathan Pishner with Apex Counseling. And today I wanted to talk about a tool for managing a very common difficulty with moods and emotions, which can work very well for a lot of people. It just requires a fair bit of practice, but it's relatively simple to explain. And what it's for is for people who have a very, very short stimulus response gap. So, stimulus response gap is the fancy psychology way of saying the time it takes between a stimulus, a thing occurring, and what our emotional response to that is. When this becomes difficult is whenever there's a short or non existent stimulus response gap. The very common phrase you'll hear for this is to be triggered. Usually, when people are talking about being triggered by something, what they really mean is that the stimulus response gap is so short as to be non existent. So the thing occurs, they have an instant and intense emotional response, and it's very difficult for them to manage because they don't really have enough time to execute on coping skills to get in the way of that emotional response. So I wanted to share how a person can help themselves with this uh, so that people, if they want to, can begin practicing. Because realistically, this is a fairly manageable thing. The only difficulty is that there's not an instant fix. It requires some practice. And that's really the barrier for a lot of people is for some folks, it requires a fair bit of practice to expand that stimulus response gap so that you can choose at least different behaviors, even if you can't choose different emotions. So let's describe a very common scenario. A lot of times, people in love partnerships will have at least one or two things that their partner does that trigger them and give them an instant emotional response. And within that emotional response, the partner does behaviors that are very, very unskillful. So let's pick anything out of the pile. Let's say that, if somebody grew up with parents who raised their voices, they might have a very, very short stimulus response gap on raised voices. So then, if their partner raises their voice at them for any reason whatsoever, or, not even at them, just raises their voice for some other purpose, it's very common for that original partner to have the stimulus of the raised voice from their partner, and basically their emotional response is either fear or anger. And it happens so instantly and so intensely, they don't have the opportunity to behave skillfully towards their partner. They immediately start shouting back, maybe, and start saying, I can't believe you'd raise your voice at me, or you'd yell at me, or something similar to that. And what that is, that's just a non existent stimulus response gap. And then a person behaves in ways that are in line with that very, very intense emotion. And this happens between love partners. This happens between parents and children. This happens at work sites. We deal with this a lot with folks with anger who keep getting fired from jobs because their stimulus response gap when somebody does something they don't like is non-existent, and they get angry at them, say something unskillful, and then get fired from a job. You see this all over the place. So here is the tool that I can give today for this. And with apologies for the fact that it's really not something that you can just immediately get massive benefit from, you have to practice it. So the main thing that I do with people whenever they have a non-existent stimulus response gap is we start doing what's called mental rehearsal. And here's what this is. When you're calm, but you know that you have something you want to work on, you have some stimulus response gap that you want to expand, what you do is you imagine the stimulus. You imagine what is the thing that makes you mad, makes you fearful, causes that massive emotional response, and you imagine it happening. Now, that will almost certainly provoke some level of that intense emotion, which is fine. And what you do is you rehearse, here is what I wish I would say. Mentally, you're going through, I wish I would say this. I want to say this. I want to do this. I want to not do this. So let's just take the love partner example again. If we did this with love partners, the person would imagine, okay, I hear my partner with their raised voice. That'll probably provoke that intense emotion in them, but they're mentally rehearsing, I want to calmly ask my partner to lower their voice. If they don't, I want to calmly tell them, okay, I've got to go take a few minutes away. I'll be back. And they mentally rehearse this. Now, here's what will happen as a person starts to do that. Very slowly, the stimulus response gap starts to expand a little bit. What probably won't happen, although if it does, hooray. But what probably won't happen is the very first time after doing some mental rehearsal, they'll be able to choose a different response. Every once in a while, you get lucky and you can have that happen. But usually, it takes many days or weeks of mental rehearsal, many minutes or hours doing this before that stimulus response gap starts to expand enough for you to actually select different behaviors, which is why it's so important to start doing mental rehearsal as early as possible and doing it preferably several times a day, basically as much as you can tolerate doing some mental rehearsal. And one of the interesting things about mental rehearsal is that it's such a powerful tool. You'll see athletes use this to expand and improve their athletic performance. Mental rehearsal is so powerful. It actually changes your physical abilities, as athletics have found out, which is wonderful news for us, because if it can improve athletic ability, it for sure can improve a person's ability to communicate somewhat more skillfully. Now, if we're going to notice some things to do about this, one of the things to notice would be really trying to mentally rehearse different scenarios that could be happening. So let's take it off love partners for a second, and let's say it's somebody who is having trouble dealing with their child. Their child does something, it instantly angers them, they start yelling at their kid. You would want to mentally rehearse receiving that stimulus at home. You'd want to mentally rehearse how you would want to handle it at the grocery store. You would want to mentally rehearse how you would handle it if other family members were present. You'd want to mentally rehearse how to handle it if you were told by a school teacher that your child did the thing. Because each of those scenarios is slightly different, and it's been proven that what we practice, context matters a lot. So if we change the context, our rehearsal becomes less good. So as you do mental rehearsal, you actually want to mentally rehearse for all of the different ways that some of these things can look, which is what makes it such a difficult thing for people to practice, because it really does, there's a tediousness to it. And so I always like to acknowledge that up front, because this tool will work if you put in the time. And just most people really struggle with wanting to put in the time until it's almost too late to save their relationship, save their job, because they let their stimulus response gap stay short for way too long. So my encouragement to you today is take this idea and start mentally rehearsing those places where you want to expand your stimulus response gap, and start with the places where you receive the most negative practical problems from it. Hurt relationships, hurt feelings, difficulty at your job, difficulty with family members. But if you do this, if you do the mental rehearsal and practice this, this will start to expand it, and you'll start to have the opportunity in the moment to select different behaviors, and over the course of time, maybe even have a different emotional response. Although realistically, that sometimes requires work with a therapist to assist you in getting a different emotional response. But it will almost certainly result in you being able to select different behaviors. So I sincerely hope this idea is helpful for someone out there today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for a few minutes. I'm Jonathan Pishner with Apex Counseling, and I will see you next time.